I don't know if Lauren's going to come up here after being baptized downstairs, but if she does, y'all need to get, loud. Y'all need to get loud, okay? Anyways, I don't know if she's going to come up here, but if she does, we'll pause. We are in the book of 2 Corinthians, for those of you who have not been with us. Well, all of us here, we have a past. We have made some choices in our life that have brought these people to us or those people to us, and we've chosen to make friends with this type of people or that type of people. Everyone in here to varying degrees has friends from their past or family from their past. People that are good, generally treat you well. People that are not so good, not the greatest influence on you. Some of you have had these sorts of friends who don't have the greatest influence on you more recently, some of you less recently, some of you for longer periods of time, some are short periods of time, where you kind of figured out, I'm not sure I want to be hanging out with this crowd, and maybe you've went a different direction. Here's how easy this is. I transitioned in high school from one high school to the next. I was a sophomore, then I was a junior, and I was at one high school and then another high school. And all the while transitioning, I just wanted to play soccer. I really didn't care about anything else. I was just like, soccer, yay, this will be fun. And so I decided to change schools because, of course, the soccer team at my first school wasn't so great. And I thought, this won't be so bad. I'll go to a school where I know some other soccer players, and then I won't be like completely new kid at school who knows nobody. I'll just hang out with the soccer guys, and that'll be great. The only problem is the soccer guys, all they wanted to do in high school was drink and smoke. And so 6 months into transitioning high schools, and I found myself throwing money into a bucket to buy one of the kids some not-so-legal drugs for his birthday, because this was the fun thing to do. See, it's quick. It's not hard to end up thinking you're hanging out with good people, and then you find yourself doing things you thought maybe you'd never do. One of the best things you can do to be successful trying to walk as a Christian, trying to figure out how to do this Christian things, one of the best things you can do, which is what we're going to talk about today, which is the plea that Paul makes to the Corinthian church, is to make room for good, godly people in your life. To make room for them as you're trying to navigate life, trying to figure out what decisions should I make, where should I go, how should I live, how should I treat people. To make room for good, godly people in your life. Now, in 2 Corinthians, for the past 2 to 4 weeks, we've seen Paul doing this. He's pleading with the Corinthians. He's saying to them, be reconciled to me. And he said multiple times and given them this laundry list of things that he has done for the good of them and all the things that he hasn't done. And he hasn't offended them in any way. 2 weeks ago, he asked the Corinthian church, he says, open your hearts to me. He says, I've opened my heart to you. Now you open your heart to me. That's the request he makes of them. And then in the last week, we talked about how Paul identified what the Corinthians' problem was. So Paul's heart is open to the Corinthians' heart is not open to him. And then last week, he identified what he thinks is probably the problem. It's that they've let unbelievers creep in and affect the way that they believe about Paul. And we talked about last week how it's not that you should walk around as Christians and never be friends with unbelievers. That's ridiculous. 6 weeks ago, we talked about how you have to be friends with people who don't believe the same as you because you're a part of this ministry of reconciliation. You're trying to bring God to be reconciled with them. So if you never have any unbelieving friends, you're not participating in that, but there's this balance where you need them to be a part of your life, but when you start leaning on them too hard, you could end up on a path you don't want to be on. Last week, Paul, I think, identified that as the Corinthians' problem. Maybe these false teachers coming in saying, maybe Paul is not really authoritative. Maybe he really doesn't know what he's talking about. This week, in chapter 7 here, we're We're going to be in verses 2 through 4. This is kind of the end of a section here. There's a section that started way back in chapter 2 where Paul's talking about his ministry. And it's just this extended 5-chapter long chat about this new covenant and the Spirit of God and what does that look like and the afterlife and all that stuff for 5 chapters. And now he's kind of transitioning out of talking about his ministry and he's going back to talking about him and the Corinthian church. The interaction between them, his travel plans. So that's where we're at. We're concluding kind of this first major section where Paul's talking about his ministry, and we're getting back to talking about the specific interaction that's happening between Paul and the Corinthian church. We're going to look at today this request of Paul to make room for him, and then we're going to look practically at what it looks like to actually make room for godly people in your life. So verse 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2. Paul says this to the Corinthian church. He says, "Make room for us in your hearts. We wronged no one. We corrupted no one. We took advantage of no one." Hey, if you've been here for the last few weeks, you're thinking, okay, he's already said this. In fact, he spent all of chapter 6 saying this. So it's kind of just like a summary of what he's already said. That's exactly what it is. This is the end of a section, and in good biblical writer, they like to end the same way they started. So he's repeating himself. He's just saying what he's already said to kind of end this section. There's nothing really new here. Although some of you may have been here, I don't know, a few weeks ago when I said that these letters, they're read out loud to people in the church. Paul writes the letter, and it goes to the church, and they take the letter, and they read it out loud in front of everybody. And a few weeks ago, I kind of said, this is what the crowd might have been going through. This is what they might have been thinking as they're reading Paul's letter. And I kind of got that again this week. If a guy was standing in front of everybody, and there were people in the crowd who didn't like Paul, and this is what Paul says, "Make room for us in your hearts. We've wronged no one. We've corrupted no one. We've taken advantage of no one." I can just see people sitting in the back row like, Paul, come on. Like, he thinks he's so holy. Like, he's always trying to put us down. He's always trying to make us worse than he is. Like, he's always trying to say how good he is. And now, not everybody in the crowd, probably just a few. Probably just the convicted few. So maybe anticipating that kind of eye-rolling person sitting in the audience somewhere, Paul responds, verse 3. He says, "I do not speak to condemn you, for I have said before that you are in our hearts to die together and to live together." He says, no, eye-roll person. I'm not trying to condemn you. I'm not trying to tell you how much better I am than you. I'm not trying to tell you how bad you are. It's not what I'm going for. He says, we've already told you that you're in our hearts to live together, to die together. Now, here's what Paul's not saying. He's not saying if the Corinthian church lives, that Paul literally continues to live, and if they die, he dies, because if that were true and there's still a church in Corinth, Paul would still be alive, and this is like 2,000 years later, and so that would be strange. 2,000-year-old Paul, he's still walking around? No. Okay, he's obviously being figurative here. He's not telling them that their fate of life or death is tied somehow to his own life or death. He's telling them we're connected. We're intricately connected. And we're connected so much so that when you feel pain, we feel pain. He's saying there's no point in us condemning you, because if we condemn you, we feel that too, because we're so connected. Parents, you know what this is like. If you ever had your kid been bullied at school, and you're about to go beat up some little kid, go to jail for the rest of your life. Why? Because your kid's being taken advantage of, and being mistreated, and you're like, I feel that. Like, I'm going to go do something about that. I'm angry. My kid's angry. I'm angry. You know what it's like if your kid walks away from God, starts finding pain and struggle, and you're watching them walk through it, and you're feeling it with them. kids struggling to make good decisions. You feel that too. Have you ever had a kid in the hospital? You're just watching them, trying to figure out how to do life, suffering. And so much so, it's the people who are outside watching that feel it so much more than the kid in the bed's like, I'm doing fine, doing great, got my feeding tube in. And yet you're watching from the outside going, it's not supposed to be like this. Parents know this who have lost a child. I've heard it described like this. It's like a piece of you is gone with them. That's what Paul's saying. To live with you, to die with you. You lose a child, it's like there's a piece that I can't get back. Spouses, you kind of know this too. You kind of know what Paul's talking about. When my wife and I lived in Austria for 13 months, we were missionaries, and there was a 2-month time span, December, January, when we had to come back, visa issues. And so we had to come back to the States, and we spent 2 months here. And during that 2 months here, my wife had some very tough conversations. Very painful, discouraging, life-changing conversations that I had to watch. And there was nothing I could do about it. And a few months later, we were back in Austria, and my family's having some trouble. We're trying to figure out how to do life as a family. You know, families, they go up, they go down. Sometimes they're good, sometimes not so good. And my family was not so good at this point. But I was 3,000 miles away. But I felt like there was a time when I should call and have a chat with my mom, apologize, say what she needed to hear, be an encouragement, because that's all I could do, 3,000 miles away. But when I called her to have that talk with her, I asked my dad if he would be in on the conversation. And I said to him when I started the conversation, Dad, I don't really have anything to say to you, but I asked you to sit and listen. I really just have some things I want to say to Mom. But I said, here's what I've learned in the first year that I've been married, because that was all 6 months after we got married, and then by the time I was talking to my parents, about 8 months after we got married. I said, here's what I know from being married for less than a year. I know that oftentimes it's much harder to watch your spouse be in pain than it is for you to actually go through it. Because there was every part of me that said, if I could just take it, if I could just bear the load, if I could be the one that was yelled at, if I could be the one that was rejected, if I could be, I would do it. But you can't. You're sitting there watching, and there's nothing you can do. And so I asked my dad, I said, would you sit in and would you just listen? Because I often know that it's probably harder for you to watch her go through all this stuff. And so he did. He sat and listened. Spouses, you know this, what he's talking about. When he says, our heart is open to you to live together, die together. This very intimate relationship he has with the Corinthian church. If you're not married and you're not a parent, a friend, a good friend, who you watch struggle. And you're going through it with them, and it's the same. That's what he's talking about. Sometimes the hardest part of letting good, godly people into your life is it feels like they're the ones who are going to condemn you. They're the ones who are going to, if I let that person in, they're going to be honest with me. They're going to hold me to a standard. If I let that person in, they're going to love me, but I'm not sure they want them to love me that way. Sometimes the hardest thing in letting good, godly people get close to you is it feels like they're the ones who are going to condemn you. It feels like they won't understand. They won't understand my thoughts. They won't understand my decisions. They won't understand my actions. Here's Paul's response. He says, I don't speak to condemn you. It's not my goal. Because We're connected. And what happens to you, I feel too. So it would be pointless for Paul to just beat them over the head because he's connected to them this way. He continues why he's not here to condemn them in verse 4. He says this, "Great is my confidence in you. I do not speak to condemn you. Great is my confidence in you. I do not speak to condemn you. Great is my boasting on your behalf. I do not speak to condemn you. I'm filled with comfort. I'm overflowing with joy for all your affection." His goal is not to tear them down. But he's telling them the truth. You've let people who don't believe the same as you creep in, ruin my character. That's what Paul's saying to the Corinthian church. Tell you lies about the gospel, blur this Jesus guy. He's saying, stop. Just open your hearts to me, he says. When I first read this verse 4, it's kind of weird. Caleb, some of you know Caleb, he's the youth pastor, and we're like a hallway down from each other in the offices downstairs during the week, and every once in a while, we'll go down to each other's office and bounce ideas off each other. I'm reading this verse going, what the heck is going on? And I'll go down to Caleb's office and be like, dude, what's going on? Like, I need to preach this weekend or next weekend. And for those of you who know, Caleb's preaching downstairs for this month. So we've been bouncing a lot of ideas off each other since we're actually preaching the same text. And he came to me last week and he said, wow. He said, what is verse 4? Like, there's all this strife, there's all this tension between the Corinthian church and Paul. They've, like, kind of rejected him. There's, like, all these... How can Paul even say to the Corinthian church, great is my confidence in you, great is my boasting on your behalf, I'm filled with comfort? He's like, no, he's not. Filled with distress. Like, what is he saying? This doesn't make any sense. Two things, possibilities. First thing is, in the chapters before, we saw Paul describe a new covenant. And part of that new covenant between God and men is the Spirit of God. Now, Paul's pretty sure that the Corinthian church has the Spirit of God. So my first response to Caleb was maybe he's relying all on the Spirit of God. Maybe he's saying, in spite of you Corinthians who can't figure out who to be friends with and who not to be friends with and can't figure out what kind of authority I have as an apostle and can't really figure out how to stop being Gentiles and start being good Christians, put all that aside, I have great confidence in you because he knows the Spirit of God lives inside of them. Maybe. Possibly. Or maybe this is the kind of, as I said, this is a transition to a new section. We're going to find out in the sections following that. So here's what happened. Paul was with the Corinthians for a year and a half. Then he left. Then he wrote a letter to them, 1 Corinthians, where he said, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to return to you. I'm going to be with you. We're going to do some more life together. Then he doesn't come back. Gets word probably from Titus, who seems to be the messenger going back and forth between them, that something has gone wrong with the Corinthian church. Somebody came in, or multiple people came in, and they started spreading all kinds of rumors, causing all kinds of distress, and now the Corinthian church is not sure what they think about Paul anymore. So instead of going back to them, Paul writes them a letter. Somewhat harsh letter. And up to this point in 2 Corinthians, all we've seen is that interaction, and then Paul writes them a letter, and then he's waiting a response. And we're not really sure what that response is going to be. Is the Corinthian church going to repent, come back to Paul, say, yeah, we know you were right, these guys are crazy, we kicked them out, whatever. Or are they just going to go off the deep end and say, you know what, Paul, don't ever come back, we don't want anything to do with you. Up to this point in the letter, we don't really know. Next week, and the week after, and the week after, we're going to see the response that the Corinthian church gives to Paul. It's positive. They respond to his kind of angry letter well. He eventually hears from them when he's in Macedonia. That's not till later. But he says in verse 4, great is my confidence in you, great is my boasting on your behalf, I'm filled with comfort. This could be hindsight. right? At this point, when he's writing, Paul has already received the letter from the Corinthian church. He knows that they're repentant. He knows that they're coming back to them. He knows that they want to have a relationship with him. So at this point, he could be saying, I'm greatly confident in you and greatly boasting in you, because he already knows the letter that he's going to receive from them. He already knows these things. Could be both. Could be him relying on the Spirit of God inside of them, and it could be him already knowing that he's going to get this letter from them. We'll talk about that more in the future weeks. But right now, make room for godly people in your life. This is what Paul requests of them. Make room for us in your hearts. Now, making room might be reorganizing. You have some room, but the way your schedule is kind of set up, you really don't have any room. But if you kind of tweak things here and there, you might be able to fit. Maybe. But more often than not, making room for something in your life means you got to remove something else. Because most of us live kind of maxed out. And it's like, well, what am I supposed to do? Just go make a bunch more Christian friends? I ain't got time for that. Well, no. Probably most of you don't. In this case, specifically, the one Paul's describing, he's telling them, you're going to have to remove some unbelievers from your life. The ones who are leading you astray. The ones who you're leaning on. The ones who you're yoked to. Is the language that he uses last week. Sometimes it feels selfish. Sometimes it feels like, I have to let this person go so I can be more healthy? Like, what if they flounder? What if they just go off the deep end? Seems selfish so that I can be better off? Like, wait a minute. It's not really seem what the New Testament says. I mean, Jesus just kind of sacrifices endlessly for everybody. So how is that not selfish? Okay, remember a couple things. First one is that God chooses to use you. He doesn't need you. And that might sound mean. He chooses to use us. It's his gracious choice to use us to influence other people. But he has access to everyone. Which means if he doesn't need me to do this, he probably needs someone else to do it. And actually by you saying, I can't do that, it forces somebody else to step up and do what God's asking them to do. Second thing, it's not just your well-being, it's your holiness. You ever consider this? Maybe there's a whole lot of things that God's asking us to say yes to. Yes, I'll change my life this way. Yes, I'll do this different. Yes, I'll be more like you, be crafted. You ever consider this? Maybe there's some things God's asking you not to do. I want you to say no to that. Oh, you want me to say no? Yes. Because that's going to lead you down the wrong path. He wants us to say yes to a whole bunch of things, but he also wants us, I think, to say no to things that will lead us away from what he has for us. For some of you, this is scary. Because I don't know if any of you have ever let Christians in. I don't know if any of you have ever been like, oh yeah, I'm going to let these people who say they believe in Jesus come close to me and like know me and love on me and try to do things. I don't know if you've done that, but some of you have done that and got burned. And so it's scary. Welcome to our life when we entered FBC, my wife and I. Because when we walked out of the other place we were worshiping at, we got burned. She got burned worse than I did. And our conversations were like, we're going to go, but we really don't want to talk to anybody. And we really don't want to know anybody. We don't want anybody to tell us anything about them because, no. And it's scary. Because when you get burned by people who are supposed to love you, it's like, I don't know, I have no interest in doing that again. That seems like a dumb idea. If you're scared and you're trying to figure out, how do I even do that? How do I even filter to make room for good, godly people in my life? A couple things. Here's what not to do. Go back to verse 2. Here's what good, godly people don't look like. Good, godly people don't wrong you. Make room for us in our hearts. We have not wronged you. They don't wrong you. Good, godly people. Good, godly people don't corrupt you. Okay, this one's a little harder. Because we're all sinners, right? So even if we're Christians, we're still struggling with it. So intentionally and sometimes unintentionally, we're walking around living life and not being completely godlike yet. So like if you're in a relationship with anybody and they could unintentionally corrupt you. So you just go living like a little hole? Like, no. Okay, there's a balance here, right? Because it's not just their level of corruption of you, it's also what are you tempted by? Because some people will be able to be in a relationship with an alcoholic, and that won't corrupt them at all. Because that's not their temptation, not their problem, not what they struggle with. Some other guy is going to walk up to the alcoholic, and their temptation is going to be to walk in the bar with them and just, yeah, I'm right there with you, buddy. Life sucks. So the corruption one is kind of two-sided. It's people don't corrupt you, but you also have a level of temptation that you have to be aware of. To know who's going to corrupt you and who you can stick in a relationship with, because people need to be stuck with when you can, when it's realistic for you. You're the only one that knows those things. Good, godly people don't take advantage of you. Paul says we've taken advantage of no one. If you've got people in your life who are just constantly taking advantage of you, those are the people you can consider saying, you know what, I got to make room for good, godly people in my life, and you're not it. Because you're constantly taking advantage of me. These are just evaluation tools, just some guidelines to know who's good, godly people and who's not. Here's what good, godly people do look like. It's verse 4. This one was kind of strange for me before I read verse 4. I've gotten in a decent habit of using the bad ones to filter people out, what good, godly people don't look like. You wrong me, you're constantly tempting me, corrupting me, you're taking advantage of me, so I'm like, yeah, I'm going to be done. I'm pretty good at doing those ones. I haven't really ever considered to evaluate whether this person's actually a positive influence. Verse 4. Good, godly people have confidence in you. Paul's the example here. Good, godly people are willing to boast about you. I had a friend in college. He was my roommate. One of my best friends now. He was my roommate in college, and when I was in college, I had a small group of college students, and we met and we studied the Bible. And that dude, my roommate, his name's Mike. That dude advertised for my group more than I advertised for my group. He was like, you all need to come. There's this leader, and he's great, and he loves God, and he's going to teach you, so y'all need to come, and it's going to be fun, and he does cool stuff. And, I mean, he was like group advertiser. Those are the people you got to keep around. The people who are willing to say, this guy, he's great. I mean, they're great. This couple, they're amazing. People who are willing to actually boast about your strengths. Paul says this, I'm filled with comfort. Good, godly people are comforted when they're around you. Here's how you could also translate that. Encouraged. I'm filled with encouragement. People who actually enjoy your presence. Imagine that. People are actually like, I love having you around. This is great. It's the person that sees the best in you. Even when you're really not looking so hot. But they're like, no, they're great. I know. And this is a little blunder, maybe a mishap, maybe a little speed bump, but I've seen them do really good things. And I believe in them. Last thing Paul says is, I'm overflowing with joy in all our afflictions. This is the person who has joy just because they're around you. Some of you are like, not all people are that easy to love. Okay, this isn't going to be like everybody you meet, okay? This is going to be like a few. I have one guy who I'm like that with. You remember the guy maybe 2 weeks ago who I talked about, the communion story that I shared 2 weeks ago? Friend of mine from college. I was a life group leader. He was the other life group leader on our floor in our dorm room, so me and him talked a lot and got close that year. He's one of the guys that I am ecstatic to see whenever I get to see him. He lives in California. He lives in Pasadena. Just got married this last February, and we went there, and we were able to go to the wedding, and his wife's great. And anytime I get a chance to see them, I'm like, yes. You got to make room for good, godly people in your life. Use these parameters. People who don't wrong you. People who aren't corrupting you intentionally or unintentionally. People who are not taking advantage of you. People who have great confidence in you. People who are willing to boast about you. People who are filled with comfort, or they're filled with encouragement when they're around you. People who are overflowing with joy when they're around you. That's the goal. You want to do this Christian life thing well? Make room for those kind of people. If you have to, make room by spending less time with some other people who don't have those characteristics. The epitome of this statement here, making room for good, godly people in your life, is if you can make room for good, godly people in your life all you want. You can spend your whole life searching for those people and making friends with them and enjoying their company and them enjoying your company. And if you miss making room for God in your life, it's all for nothing. You could spend years and years and years and years and years figure out how to discern between good people in your life, get them around you, and miss God and miss eternity. And it's all for nothing. You lived a great life on earth to spend the rest in torment.